Alrighty, alrighty. Let's go live. God bless you. I hope that you are doing well. Who is Tehuti? We're going to talk about Tehuti today. We want to kind of get a chance to talk about some things. We've been talking about quite a bit of things and talking about a lot of Kemetic deities and things from a Kemetic perspective and a Kushite perspective. And it's time we talked about wisdom. Let's talk about Tehuti and let's talk about wisdom. Let's start to get into ask this question. What was Tehuti? What does Tehuti represent? And how can we apply this to our lives today? Is there any application for this concept and this idea of wisdom and God's will, and how do we work that out? So I want to say thank you so much for joining. We're going to jump right in. I thank you so much for those who have been supportive and who've been helpful. And I just want to say really quickly that for those who've been helpful, I want to let you know that, and those who are members here on YouTube, I want to let you know that I uploaded a new course. So there's a new course on our member website. It's called Who Was a Set? And I'd like to not only make videos and talk about various things, but also provide other resources. So for those who are members on YouTube, and it's only $4.99 a month at the member level, and then there's an ancestor level as well. I like to be able to offer things in other mediums. So video is great because it's a wonderful way to kind of engage and kind of look at things. But some of us also want to have things you can read, because reading allows you to process information in a way that's personal to you. When you're looking at a video, which is great, you're hearing me talk, you're hearing that person talk, and you're hearing, my voice. You're hearing that information that you can kind of bounce off of, get ideas, have conversations with, leave comments down below. But when you start to read something and you take it to that level, you start to then internalize it. It's no longer, my voice, it's your voice. It's you, the person who's perceiving it, putting your own ideas and your own perceptions on these concepts and figuring out a way to apply it to your life. So as you start to think about that, that's where real growth comes in. And I think that's why when we talk about our set and we talk about prayer and dedication to the divine, and why meditation is so important, the whole idea around reading, the whole idea of being able to read and to take this information, any information, into yourself, into your spirit, and kind of breathe on it, listen to it, so to speak, put your own words in it and fill in the blanks with your own ideas, allows it to make an impact on your soul, allows it to be something that becomes a part of you, which is what the Shabaka stone was saying, what King Shabaka was saying. When you hear something and you see it and you breathe on it, it helps your beliefs come forth. And that's why reading is so important. So as you know, if you're a member here on YouTube, if you're a member, you know that I have put together a library. So I'm putting together a library that you have access to, members have access to. You can download these resources. King Sahure, about King Taharka, various things about Tutmos III, various things, as well as courses that are combined with videos and downloadable textbooks, if you will, mini textbooks that you can read that go along with it. So I'm trying to create a library so that you can read it, collect these resources. And I pray and I thank you for those who are sticking with me, who've stuck with me and have been supporters month after month and continue to provide support, because it helps me do this and helps me kind of enjoy what I'm doing. So I very much appreciate your comments. I appreciate what you do. I want to say thank you to members. And I want to let you know that this course is up and available for you to take a look at. And I will post information on our members only tab, in our community tab for members only. I will also be uploading several other resources in the very near future. And I'll be letting you know a couple more courses that you can kind of read and put some things together with, as well as another resource, which I'll talk about in just a second. So thank you so much for those who are paid members. I very much appreciate it. Thank you so much. So as we go here and we kind of talk about this, we kind of jump back into this. We're going to talk a little bit about Tehuti and just talk about Tehuti and who Tehuti is and why that's significant for us. Because, as we talk about Kemetic theology and Kemetic deities, we have a lot of reasons and a lot. And thank you so much for joining. God bless you. Thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it. We have a lot of things that we've talked about a lot of ways in which, people that are not in the distant past and are not so distant past embody a lot of these concepts from a Kemetic perspective. And that it's not just important for us to just know these things as things we have on a wall, just like I was talking about courses that I've made, that I'm making available to members. It's important for us to take this and make this a part of our lives. Like, what is this for if it's not a part of our life, right? What is all of the Kemetic theology and the pretty buildings and the wonderful things they did, the wonderful artifacts and the amazing things that they said and their didactic literature and all the wisdom things that they said? What is that for if it can't be applied to our lives? I think our ancestors in the near past view and the distant past did things for the perspective of very practical reasons. You will find that a lot of people, Native Americans, people all over the world, from the Far East, Japan, various places, people did things for practical reasons. They didn't just, grow food and throw half of it away or just, decide to make a way of transportation and have it be wasteful. They did things with respect to things that were very practical, and their spirituality and the way they approached life and their idea of God and how it applied to them was also very practical. I don't think they practice these things for us to just look at them and say they're pretty and just forget about them. I don't think that was the whole point of it. The whole point of it was to apply it to your own life so that you could become an Asar, so that you could become a divine person, so that you could experience peace, so that you could experience Hotep, so that you could please God and be able to experience those blessings, not only in this life, but in the afterlife. That's what it's all about. How do you experience blessings and peace in the afterlife and in this life? That's what it's about. So as we talk about the whole concept of Asar and who was a Tehuti and various things, we start to jump into some aspects of what Tehuti was and what Tehuti represented. And as I mentioned before, I don't think we have to go in the distant past to be able to look at these things or to see people who embody concept of Tehuti and concept of various deities. And when I think about Tehuti, I think about Ida B. Wells. And the concept of Tehuti, in my perspective, is God's will. When you think about what God wills for your life, what God's will is for the universe, for things that be, what God's plans are. We talked about being able to establish our own will, but also the idea of God's will that's established, God's plan for your life. That becomes part and parcel the same as wisdom. When you think about what wisdom is, when you think about what you do when you do something right, or what's the smart way, what's the right way to go, you're really thinking about wisdom, which is in accordance with God's will. So when you think about Tehuti, you think about Tehuti as a manifestation of God's will and manifestations of God's plan. The idea of someone being able to take note and to write down what you've done with your life, to document what the deities have done, to kind of document those things that are true, document those things that are right, and reconcile that with your ability to be at peace in the afterlife, with your ability to enjoy peace and your ability to be able to walk into that peace in the afterlife. And as I think about it, obviously there are a whole lot of people that we've been talking about recently in the past several days. There's a whole lot of people we've been talking about who I believe embody various concepts of Kemetic theology and Kemetic deities, whether it's Asar, with Frederick Douglass, Harry Tubman, or Tehuti. And as we start to think about and start to talk about, various people and start to think about, Ida B. Wells and what Ida B. Wells represents. And I see Ida B. Wells as someone who took the concept of writing. And Tehuti was represented, as you can see, and you can see in this depiction right here, someone who wrote down and took note of a person's actions and took note of what a person did with their lives and reconciled that to whether or not that was true. And as they reconcile that, whether or not there was truth had to be written by you. And so Tehuti and a lot of these stories and a lot of the tales from a Kemetic perspective doesn't speak a lot. Tehuti is very quiet, and none of the other deities really question Tehuti. Tehuti can be both judge as well as scribe, as well as that person who's paying attention, who's very attentive, knows what's happening and documenting what's going on. A lot of times God's plan is not going to be loud. It's just going to be, because it doesn't have to compete with anything. It's going to win out, and no matter what, it's going to win. And when you think about that, then Tehuti is associated with writing and documenting things. And as I think about that, and I started to think about Ida B. Wells, and I think about a lot of things that she did with her life, Ida B. Wells was a master, if you would, at writing. And as I think about, how she wrote and the things that she did, and this is one of her books, The Arkansas Race Riot. Some of the things she did, when you read her work, and I haven't had a chance, all my life to read everything that she's done, and a lot of things I've read, but if you start to dig into what she's written, and whether it's Southern Horrors or, Mob Rule in New Orleans or the Arkansas Race Riot, she is, and all these books, by the way, I'm going to be making available on my site for members. I have it available in other ways, but I'm going to make this available for those who are at the ancestor level. So this book, Arkansas Race Riot, will be available for those who are members, just in case you want to read it and dig into it, because I've written, not only recreated what she wrote, but also finished this story of the Arkansas Race Riot. And in this race riot, if you read Ida B. Wells's information, especially New Orleans Mob Rule and this Arkansas Race Riot, she talks about very, very poignantly, very, very, obviously and very conspicuously the things that were going on with respect to lynching. And that she was a crusader, in her own words, for lynching, trying to uncover the truth about what was being said. And as we think about Tehuti, we think about truth, and we think about God's will and God's plan. She was trying to uncover the truth of many of the things that were going on in 1919 and thereafter, right? All these, and before that, even before that, all of these horrible riots and lynchings that were going on, where they were telling lies. She was there digging, whether it was in 1895 or, like I said, 1919 or various places, she was digging into, why did these things really take place? She was digging into, what was going on in terms of really the relationship between the men and the women who were supposedly at the crux of why this person was being lynched or had been lynched. She was uncovering it. And many times, the lie was being told was that this African-American man was attacking this woman, and that's why they had to kill him and burn him alive and take parts of his body and sell it and crazy things like that. And she would go investigate. She would actually go uncover the truth and find that, wait a minute, these stories are not what people are saying. The little girl that they said was involved with, who they said was like a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, it was a 17 or 18-year-old, and she was in a consensual, willing relationship with this man. This is what happened, and they're lying about it in the news and in the newspapers. She was uncovering relationships that existed, and one of the things she talks about in the Arkansas Race Riot, she talks about the economic impact. If you are familiar with the Arkansas Race Riot, it took place in October of 1919, in the red summer of 1919, where many people were killed. Many people died as World War I was ending, and a lot of African American soldiers were coming back to America, and they had the opportunity to have uniforms and guns as they would as their right to have as they were serving their country. All kinds of things broke loose, and it wasn't just on people who were in uniform. It was all kinds of things broke loose, and whether it's Omaha, Nebraska, or Washington D.C. or Chicago, Illinois, or this place in Arkansas. Elaine, Arkansas. In this particular place in Elaine, Arkansas, there were several men. There were many people who were killed in this horrible event that took place in the fall of 1919 in Elaine, Arkansas. Many people killed. And as a result of people being burned and a whole church being burned and people being shot up in the church and all kinds of things happening to African American people, there were, of course, black people who were arrested. And not white, but black people who were arrested. And some men were put on death row. And you see a picture of these men here who were put on death row and we're going to be executed for crimes they did not commit. We're going to be executed in a way that, was just an atrocity and atrocious in terms of just the justice that was not being done to them. The way that they got people to talk about them, the witnesses who were coerced and threatened, the lies that were being told, the lack of representation that they had, the lack of even knowing what they were being charged with. Some of these men went to trial in Arkansas and did not know what their charges were, or how they were even going to be tried until they showed up in court. They were held without being told what they were being charged for until they got to court. Some of them had lawyers who were assigned to them who did not even speak on their behalf. Craziness happened, and Ida B. Wells talks about this entire story, and I write about it in the book that I said that I'll make available on my site for members. I'll make available. It's not just that she talked about it. After it was over, there was a whole court cases that went through the Arkansas Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court, and these men eventually won their freedom. But it's a whole bunch that went to it, and I write about the rest of what happened. I kind of pick up where she left off, where Ida B. Wells left off, and I write the rest of the story in terms of what happened. But the interesting things about it is that she talks a lot about the whole economics of it. She talks a lot about why these people were being attacked and killed in the first place, how the cotton that they were growing and the various crops they were growing was very, very expensive on the market. It was bringing a pretty penny, and that these people were basically being cheated out of their money and cheated out, from a sharecropping standpoint, their livelihood and the work that they put into it. And that it wasn't just about hating them or just about, the union that they believe African-American people were starting to form. And they said they were forming a union that was going to be a threat to white people. So that's why they attacked them. That's what part of what they said. But she talks about how the crops that were taken over, many of the things that were burned, and many of the possessions, many of these people had their possessions just taken. They had their homes vacated. They had to get out. Not only were the men killed, many men killed, the ones who weren't killed had to leave. Many of their wives had to leave. Some of their wives were also locked up. They had to leave the places where they were living and also being employed. The furniture they had, their belongings, they had to get out in a moment's notice. And many of them, when they came back weeks later, had their furniture gone. And even in situations where they would go to the person who they were quote unquote working for as a sharecropper and find their clothes and their furniture in that person's house. They literally went by and just took black people's stuff. And they not only took their furniture and their clothes, similar to what they did in Tulsa, they took the crops. And the crops, and Ida B. Wells talks about this, the crops that were available at that time were very, very expensive. We're getting a pretty penny on the market. The cotton that they were growing was capturing a pretty penny on the market. So they were not only capturing, people and taking their belongings, they were taking their wealth, right? She talks about this as being a grab for wealth. And the reason why it jumps out at me, we start to think about Tehuti, when we start to think that whole idea of telling the truth, that whole idea of digging beneath what is being said and the lies that people tell you and trying to get at it. She was an example of it. You know, she talked about it at a time when it was highly unpopular to talk about relationships that took place between black men and white men, women that were consensual, talking about that and saying that openly and saying that it's just lies, that you're trying to say that all these things are happening in a bad way. That's not the truth. You should tell the truth that many of your women are attracted to black men, and many of these things are not the way you said it, and many of your women are not as virtuous as you would like to say, if you consider that not to be virtuous. She said these things in the early 1900s and late 1800s. And in addition to that, she talked about the economics of it. She talked about, why wouldn't they stop in New Orleans when the mobs were, and the whole Robert Charles, when the mobs were going crazy for days, and why wouldn't they stop as we went around and took people black people off of streetcars and beat them in the street and killed them for days. And it wasn't until the newspaper started talking about it and the word started getting to places like New York, and it started to maybe affect the bonds that New Orleans wanted to float in order to raise money, that the authorities came out and put a stop to the violence. They did it for economic reasons. That's what she called out. And she talked about the same thing in this Arkansas Race Riot in Elaine in 1919, how a lot of this was about grabbing people's crops and the money. Black people were standing to make a decent amount of money, especially if they unionized and began to keep more of the money from the crops that they grew. They stood to make a pretty penny. And the folks in Elaine, Arkansas changed all that by killing him on that fateful night. But Ida B. Wells spoke up. She wasn't afraid to speak up. And as I think about that, God bless you, Zebby Tim. God bless you. Hope you scribe of the Neteru, right? Yeah, tell the scribe of the Neteru. You think about that. If you think about all the major people who are fighting at the end of the 1800s, because Ida B. Wells was born in 1862, so she was literally born in slavery. She was a child. Her parents were enslaved. She was born in slavery, but it was during the Civil War, and she ended up being able to be free after, obviously, the Civil War and all that worked out. Here you think of all the people who were fighting in the 1800s, whether you're talking about Frederick Douglass or in the early 1900s, W.B. Du Bois, and you can think about a whole list of people, Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, a whole list of people fighting in this long time frame. She stands out for her writing, and that's a very good point you make. There is a very good point you make. Teppy Slim, there's a very good point you made. She's like a scribe of the Neteru. When you start to look at all these people who are fighting, she stands out for her weapon with a pen, where she begins to tell the truth and to uncover the truth with writing. And when you start to think about that, what does that represent in your life? What does truth represent in your life? And it's a thing about truth that you got to tell it and live it. Right? It's not something that you can just play with. You got to live out your own truth, and you got to tell your own truth, and you got to tell the truth, and not just in small and big ways. You got to be able to live this and tell us. And I mentioned that Maya Angelou said famously, it takes courage to practice all other virtues. Right? It takes courage to love. It takes courage to hope. It takes courage to have faith. It takes courage to tell the truth. Truth becomes a significant part of your ability to be divine. Truth becomes a significant part because sometimes your calling in your life requires you to tell the truth. And it's not popular, right? A lot of times the truth is not popular. Harriet Tubman wasn't a popular person in the place from which she ran away. She wouldn't have been popular amongst the people who were looking for her. A lot of people were not popular. They become popular later on. But a lot of times when you're saying things and you're living your truth, you're not popular, right? And when you start to think about this, you start to say, so what does that mean? You have to sometimes get your satisfaction and your peace from what you do, from how you live your life, from how you please God, not from what people say. That can't be your satisfaction. If you're living a life where you have to please other people in order for you to be at peace, in order for you to live truth, you're never going to be at peace. You're never going to get the reward that you're going to get. You need to get your reward and your peace from how you live your life. From truth. When you can be happy with the truth, when you can be happy in your truth, you can be happy with telling the truth, and that's all the reward you need, you're going to find yourself being at peace. You're going to find yourself being happy when a lot of other people are not. There are a lot of people right now dealing with things that have happened with politics and people being in office that are difficult, but can't see beyond how we get beyond it. Can't see beyond how we do it. You got to deal with truth. You can't wait for somebody to validate your truth or to accept it. You have to know that God's plan is in control, that God has a plan for you, that our Savior and our sanctity and the saving of us is not going to be tied to one person. It's going to come through us. It's going to come through you. It can't come from anybody else. It's got to go. So you have to know that this is part of a plan for you to rise up. This is a part of a plan for you to live out your life. And as soon as we start to do that, you start to see changes in your own life. You'll start to see changes in your environment. You'll start to see changes in your community. You'll start to see changes around you because this stuff is real. This stuff is powerful. Our ancestors weren't talking about it for nothing. They were talking about it because it's real. So when you start to live truth, because that's what you want to do, because it gives you peace, that's when it becomes significant. That's when you start to see this connection. That's when you start to connect with Tehuti, right? That's when you start to say, okay, what is Tehuti talking about? Because now I'm walking in truth for truth's sake. I'm walking in truth for my own reasons, because this is what I'm supposed to do with my life. This is how I live my life. This is how I speak. This is what I do. Now I'm starting to connect with something that's a little bit beyond that. I'm starting to connect with something that's a little bit deeper than that. And that's what I believe Ida B. Wells was doing. And as we start to think about it, and we start to go back to that whole idea of truth, you start to understand then it becomes tied to a plan for your life, right? And I know people ask the question, is there a will? Is there fate? And those types of things. It becomes tied to a plan for your life. Ida B. Wells had a plan for her life. She had a destiny. Now we can sit back and argue. Don't even whether you has destiny or not. You can argue that that's up to you if you want to have that argument. At the end of the day, it's probably a waste of time. It's better for you to figure out what it is and to focus on that in terms of how you live your life, right? Because at the end of the day, she had a choice. That fateful day when her very close friend was lynched there in Memphis. Three men were lynched, and one of them was very close to her. I think she was a godmother for his children, very close to the family. And she saw things in the paper the next day. She heard horrible things of people talking about, supposedly they didn't know who lynched them. They were in jail. The men were being held in jail. They were taken out of jail, released by the authorities to a mob. The mob took them out back to a train tracks and took them outside of the town, outside of Memphis, and killed them, lynched them and shot them. And she read, and she in the newspapers the next day talked about one of her very close friends, telling people to leave Memphis, to leave the town because there's nothing there for black people. And that apparently his fingers had been shot off, where I guess he had grabbed a gun as the people were trying to shoot him, and his fingers were shot off. And she talks about how is it that the newspapers can be so specific and write about what was said when he was being killed, that he said these things for black people to leave Memphis, that his fingers were blown off. How could the newspapers the very next morning, the very next day after the lynching, be so specific about what happened and not know who did it? Where are the sources? Why didn't they speak out? She had a choice. Ida B. Wells could have said, this is, she was the editor of a newspaper, and a lot of people didn't know that she was completely behind it as a woman. Here she is in the 1800s as a woman behind this. She could have said, this is going to be hard. I'm scared. They could kill me, because certainly if they found out it was her doing it, they probably would have killed her and could have caught her. They could kill me. But she had a choice, and she said no. She said, I can't do it. I can't let these men, I can't let my brothers get killed like that and not say anything. I can't let all these things. It was almost as if the paper was jumping out. The words on the paper were jumping out at her, saying, this is ridiculous. Look at what they said here. They had to know this. They knew the time. They knew about his fingers. They knew what was happening with his teeth. They knew what he said. They knew about his wife. They knew all these things, but they can't tell the police who did it. The police aren't asking where did they get these details from. She did that, and she also wrote and did things within churches and began to organize things in churches there in Memphis and in various places to get out pamphlets and to get the word out about what was happening with lynching. She then decided to go in places like Mississippi and to investigate things that she heard about and read about in terms of lynching, to say what really happened. Let me interview the people who were there and who were involved, and let me see what they have to say. And she often came with very different stories. And so when I started to think about it, she had a choice in her life. She could have followed that path or said no. Even when she had to leave Memphis and went to New York and met with one of the African-American editors there, and he said, I knew it was you. She had a choice. She could have stopped. She never stopped. She continued even to 1919 when she's writing about the Arkansas Race Riot. She's still talking and following the plan that God has for her life. When you think about your plan for your life, when you think about what you're here to do, you can spend your time wondering if you have a plan, or just figure it out, or focus on it, right? What is it that I'm supposed to do? When you think about that, you start to have a choice. You start to say, then I know my truth. It's not but so long that you can hide about whether or not you have a purpose. There's not so long you can hide, because it's going to find you. It's going to keep coming. And if you don't answer it, if you don't address it, it'll probably drive you mad. It'll probably drive you crazy. If you don't start to address what God has for your life, she would never have been happy. She would never have forgiven herself if she just let those men die and never spoke up. If she just did not speak up for the men in Arkansas on a race riot, if she didn't speak up for the people in New Orleans or did all the crusading she did against lynching, she would never have forgiven herself. Instead, she chose to be true to her heart. Kind of like what Frederick Douglass was saying, when you know something is true, when you have a divine calling or divine input on your life, it's better for you to live true to that and not care about what other people say than to have endure your own aberration and your own disappointment in yourself. It's better for you to deal with other people's disappointment than to deal with your own. And so that when you start to think about it, that's where truth comes in. And I see her as somebody having a plan for her life. Somebody, you have a plan for yours. I have a plan for mine. If you embrace it, if you think about it, that's when you start to live this idea of Tehuti. That's when you start to say, am I connecting my ideals and my beliefs and my behaviors with what is true? Because it's not just whether or not you speak the truth, it's also whether or not you're living it. And are you in tune with the divine plan that God has for your life? So I say that because she had a choice. Anybody else had a choice, and you have a choice. Do you have a choice? Do you have a choice in your own life in terms of how you will live it? Whether you will live out what God has for you or not, whether you will avoid or kind of sneak around or kind of skate around, be a scapegoat, if you will, or take a scapegoat for around what it is you need to do with your life. How we live that. And I think about that. That becomes why we start to talk about things with respect to this whole idea of Tehuti and this whole idea of what it represents. Now, what does it represent in our life? What does it represent for us to be able to do? In this picture here, Tehuti is pouring the breath of life, if you will. It's Tehuti and Horus. And here he's pouring the breath of life onto Hatshepsut. And you can find this in her temple in southern Kemet. And, here's this black man, this Tehuti, who is pouring on to the king, the ruler, if you will, Hatshepsut of ancient Kemet, pouring onto her the breath of life. You start to say that when you live truth, when you work according to the divine plan and God's divine will for your life, you start to be able to find that many things open up for you. There's a peace that you live. There's a non-resistance that you will find in your life. There are places you can go that you never thought you'd be able to go when you start to open up to this and look at it in this way. So I just wanted to talk about that and kind of share that with you and talk about Tehuti as truth, as divine will, as God's divine will and plan for you in your life and how you can speak it and live in truth. So I just wanted to share that with you. Please leave your comments down below. Let me know what you think. How do you live out the truth? What are your thoughts about this? How do you embrace this whole idea of Tehuti and God's will and plan? I'd love to hear what you think. So God bless you. I want to thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you very soon. God bless you.